Mr. Donald Ruth was born on July 12, 1946, in Reading, Pennsylvania. His childhood was normal by the standards of the time he lived in. He was a part of a farm family. He had 9 other brothers and sisters, each of which had their own job on the farm. Mr. Ruth played baseball through his high school days. He says that playing baseball is one of the events after school that he could look forward to. Once he was drafted and sent away from his family, his everyday routine would change. Mr. Ruth arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He was thrown right into the cycle along with some other soldiers he would fight with in Vietnam. Basic training consisted of a daily routine, which started in the morning with a 5-mile runner.
Do you have any significant memories from basic training?
Very hot, very grueling. You had to, you sweated a lot. You had to do a lot of things that you weren't normally used to doing.
Breakfast varied depending on what was being done that day. Basic training was an 8-week course, and after Mr. Ruth completed the course, he was sent out to advanced training with some of the men he met at basic training. There was 1 week for Mr. Ruth to return home to see his family again. They were overjoyed to see him one more time before he would be gone again, and eventually in combat. After his short visit with his family, it was time for him to leave to advanced training. He had training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Mr. Ruth talked about his opinions between the 2 states. He talked of how he preferred Pennsylvania over Oklahoma, mainly due to him being in Pennsylvania his whole life. One of his main reasons for the preference was scenery. Advanced training was more aimed at what Mr. Ruth would be doing in Vietnam. It was not quite as grueling as basic training. After he finished in Fort Sill, he was sent to Oklahoma, California, to be sent to Vietnam.
Mr. Ruth was sent to Vietnam by ship. He was on the ship for a total of 1 week. The ride was tiring, as they were on rocky waters the whole time. Many men got seasick, but Mr. Ruth did not. Once they arrived on the beaches of Vietnam, they had to run to their base. They started to fill sandbags along with men who were already present at the base when they reached their station. The first night for Mr. Ruth consisted of no sleep. He was put on watch duty with another man. He talked to him for a short time, but never became close to him. Mr. Ruth would write letters home during his free time. He would write these letters to his fiancée, who is currently his wife, his friends, and his family.
How difficult was it to communicate with everyone back home?
Well, I never had an opportunity outside of writing. All you could do was write. You write letters, and then see, since I was in the artillery, our units were it's a mobile artillery piece of equipment. So we went from point to point inside Vietnam. We went from our base camp, which was in Phu Loy, and we went through Saigon and into the mountains and the woods. So the mail had to catch up. We didn't get letters maybe sometimes for a month and a half.
During Mr. Ruth's time in Vietnam, he was a part of a few battles. One major one that he was a part of was the Tet Offensive. In this battle, he was a Sergeant E5 in charge of a howitzer tank. His job was to fire at the incoming Vietnamese soldiers. This battle lasted about 20 hours, starting in the evening and lasting into the next morning. In other battles, Mr. Ruth was responsible for giving support fire to the infantrymen. His howitzer would fire 15 miles with an exploding radius of 150 meters. This gave the infantrymen much help when they needed to charge at the Vietnamese. Mr. Ruth was sent home between February and March in 1969. He arrived in Alaska. From there, he and his group flew to California. After that, he and his group went their separate ways back to their homes. And Mr. Ruth flew to Philadelphia, where his family met him, and they drove back to Reading. Mr. Ruth learned many things from his time in the service.
Thinking back on the war now, what lessons did you learn?
Live one day at a time. Take one day at a time.
How do those lessons affect your life now?
Well, it's kind of basically been my motto since I got discharged. You try and do what you can in the time you have, because you never know how long or whatever's going to happen down the road.
In conclusion, Mr. Donald Ruth was a Sergeant E5 in charge of a howitzer tank in Vietnam and came home with a very valuable lesson. Thank you, Mr. Ruth, for participating in the Veterans History Project, and thank you for your service.